Thanks. This is the 10 o'clock session on economic development, ending global poverty. The Kehoe School cannot be slighted for lacking ambition to end global poverty. My name is Bill Evans. I'm a faculty member here in the economics department, and I'm going to be chairing the panel. Our panel today has two primary presentations. The first is going to be by Carol Graham, who is a Leo Pazwalski Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and College Park Professor at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Maryland. She is also a Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor. She writes on poverty, inequality, insecurity, the political economy of market reform, subjective well-being, and the economics of happiness. Our second major presentation is going to be by Deb Bhattacharya, who is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and chair of the Southern Voice on Post-Millennium Development Goals. He is a former ambassador and permanent representative of Bangladesh to the World Trade Organization and the UN offices of Geneva and Vienna. One of our speakers today was unable to make it, Rob Stavins. So I have been asked to make some introductory comments that'll go maybe 10 minutes that kind of capsulize some of the discussion that's going to go on here. I'm a little bit out of my elements. I run a lab over in our department that focuses on domestic poverty, so I'll try not to make too many mistakes. But the title of my talk is Growth, Poverty, CO2 and Laudato Si. The basics for what I want to talk about is that if we want to end global poverty, clearly the most successful poverty eradication program is economic growth. When economies are growing at a rapid rate, especially lower developed countries, we're going to have tremendous change in the standard of living for the people in those countries. And over the past 20 years, we've seen a rapid increase in the standard of living for a number of countries, most notably China. In this graph, I've created an index of GDP per capita where 1980 is 1. And so if it goes to 2, it's double. It goes to 3, it's tripled. Between 1980 and 2011, you see that the red line, which are the developed OECD countries, have steady growth over this time period in their per capita income, which is staggeringly large over the low and middle income countries. And the blue line had growth that exceeded that of low and middle income countries until the late 1990s, when there was a rapid increase in the growth for these low and middle income countries, to the point where since the 1980s their per capita income has grown by a factor of 7. Staggering change. A lot of this change has been driven by the movement of people from farms to cities to the manufacturing sector so they can make goods that can be sold in the open markets. So this growth has been really fostered by exports. This is a percentage change in exports between 80 and 2013 for China, India, Brazil, Mexico, and Uganda. The numbers are staggering. Increase in exports from China has been over 11,000%. Even in Mexico, it's been over 2,000% over that time period. Exports allow the countries to sort of engage in the world market. This globalization has changed dramatically the lives of people at the lower end of the spectrum. This is a fraction of people living on less than $1.90 a day back in 1980 or around 1980, depending upon when the data is available. In China and Uganda, that was almost 90% of the population. If you go forward to about 2010, these numbers have declined dramatically across most of these countries to the point where less than 11% in China. The World Bank estimates that between 81 and 2012, 1.2 billion people are now not living under $1.90 a day compared to back in 1981. This doesn't mean we've solved the problem. It just means that large strides can be made when there are dramatic changes. If you take a look at things that are not sort of economy related, just the mortality rate for people 0 to 5. At the world level, this is deaths per 1,000. That group has gone from 140 to about 55. Almost all of this has been what's happening in low middle income countries and not necessarily in the developed world. So there's been tremendous growth there. The importance of economic growth, I think, can be illustrated in this simple presentation. Suppose we take a look at current conditions in Chad, which has a GDP of about 1,600 per person, infant mortality rates about 10%, life expectancy of 48 years. About 80% of people are still in farming. Let's take a look at another country that's not identified right now that has very similar observed characteristics, a lot higher infant mortality, very similar life expectancy, and slightly higher per capita GDP. Just to give you some frame of reference, this is the current numbers for the United States, where we have less than 1% infant mortality and a life expectancy of about almost 80 years. Why is this middle country important? Because this is the United States in 1850. So growth can solve a lot of problems. This growth, the importance of globalization, was recognized by Benedict in Caritas and Veritate when he said that globalization has been the principal driving force behind the emergence from underdevelopment of whole regions, and itself represents a great opportunity. The problem with globalization, obviously, is it comes with a cost. These are very poor countries that need electricity. They need to produce products. So they're going to rely on the latest available technology, which are things like fossil fuels. So if you take a look at world CO2 emissions in billions of metric tons, the notice has gone from 20 to 35 between 1980 and 2011. Well, where has this growth occurred? This growth occurred in the same countries that are growing right now. And so in OECD developed countries, there has been much movement. In other countries that aren't in those two categories, there's been very little change. Almost all the growth has been lower middle income countries. So the question is how can we allow these, or how can we help these people grow at the same time, not sort of make the same mistakes that the developed world has made in terms of polluting the environment, which is a very difficult question. So now Laudato Si sort of provides a nice framework for addressing this. It talks about how we can think about climate change within the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I think the first part of the document is actually quite nice in terms of framing this question within what we see in the Catholic Church. But I think that as you move on in the document, it starts to become much more problematic. I think the problem in the document is that, first of all, it misses entirely the reason for the problem. It seems to lay at the feet the markets, and it argues that markets are these powerful things that stimulate excess demand for products. I think demand for excess products is driven by the fallen nature of man and in original sin. People are inherently selfish people, and it's a struggle to fight that. And I don't think markets have much to do with it. They're providing products for people. And I mean, the one thing that's quite disturbing in the document is, like, the big example is air conditioning. And, there's this reliance on air conditioning. But the fact of the matter is, air conditioning is really important in terms of saving lives in hot summer days. There's a nice paper by a group of people out of the NBER that takes a look at excess mortality from heat days in the United States, and they find out that this has been reduced by 80% over the 20th century. All of it by air conditioning, to the point where there's 3,000 less deaths per year because of air conditioning in the country. So to lay at the feet an example that's actually life-saving in some context, I just don't think is well thought out. The real problem in terms of why we have problems on the climate side is what we teach in introductory economics classes. We have an unpriced aspect of production that is not borne by market participants, and hence there's going to be a lot of overproduction. And so as a result, what do we want to do about it? This sort of confusing nature in the document is kind of interesting because in the document they have some claims from Caritas and Veritate. One of them by Pope Benedict is kind of right up the alley of economists. He says the economic and social costs of using up shared environmental resources are recognized with transparency and fully borne by those who incur them, not by other peoples or future generations. What's Benedict saying? He's saying we should internalize the costs. We should make the people who generate these emissions pay for them through the market. Now, one solution to this is obviously to try to internalize the cost through things like carbon taxes. One other problem that I find in Laudato Si is that the encyclical has this sort of negative view of the market, and so what it does then is kind of throw out any type of market mechanism that could actually deal with climate change. So in this country, we have SO2 cap and trade situations, and we have one in the EU that hasn't worked nearly as well. There are a lot of market mechanisms that have proven to be fairly useful in this context. Now, there's going to be some command and control that you could potentially use, but it's command and control is going to be awfully difficult to go to countries and say, maybe you should slap on some more scrubbers in your plants or invest in more expensive fuels when they don't have running water and things like that. And so more innovative solutions to the problem that involve the market, I think, are going to be necessary. So all at the end, this is a relatively difficult problem. These countries have to have the right to grow. The way that they're going to grow is they're going to build fossil fuel plants. And the question is then how can we assist in this process? So it's going to end up to be a fairly difficult transition. So with that as a backdrop, that's my 8 minutes on this. We're going to move on to Carol. So we're going to have two presentations, Carol and Deb, and then we're going to have some discussion up here maybe, and then we're going to open it up to the audience as well. So without further ado, Carol.
Just have to figure out how to switch presentations. Is that on slideshow? Yeah, that's great. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you, and thanks, Bill. Indeed, I love your air conditioning example because it speaks to some of the progress paradoxes that I'm going to be talking about. So in my time, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this new science of well-being measurement, which it's really become, can tell us about poverty traps and progress paradoxes around the world, and why these metrics help us understand poverty a little better or in a deeper way than we might when we just look at income-based metrics. When I first started in this art of measuring happiness, well-being, and we measure it now in many distinct dimensions, I was one of a few crazy outlier economists who people thought we were really nuts. This isn't about in the early part of late 1990s, early 2000s. But over time, more and more people started working on this. We were rather surprisingly collaborating with psychologists, which was an unusual thing for economists to do. And then one of them, Danny Kahneman, was the first psychologist to get the Nobel Prize in economics, and that shook things up a little bit. But anyway, the work of a lot of people contributing to this, and then also, I think, a lot of interest in the topic, not just from academics, but from policymakers, has given the whole idea of including well-being, the concept of well-being, and then measures of well-being in official policy much more momentum. And now we have really remarkable momentum. I could never have predicted this 10 years ago, but we have the OECD having recommendations for statistics offices around the world in terms of how to measure well-being. The UK actually has well-being metrics in its official statistics every year. Even the US, we had a National Academy of Sciences panel where we were tasked with recommending which metrics we would put in our statistical system, and actually there are a remarkable number of them, although not in the US Census, which is what everybody thinks about, but they're woven into a lot of our national statistics. So there are three themes that come out in my research that I think are really important when thinking about well-being and poverty and progress paradoxes. And one is why the particular definition of well-being matters. And I'll talk a bit about these definitions. But people with less agency and capability, very poor people, may conceive of well-being differently when they answer these questions. The second theme is adaptation and progress paradoxes. And then the last is what's a meaningful change in well-being. So I'll speak to all of those. One of the things that's useful about these metrics is that they're well suited for answering questions that traditional revealed preferences approaches don't answer very well. Situations where individuals don't have the agency to make choices, or when consumption decisions are not the result of optimal choices. So think of macro and institutional arrangements individuals can't change. I think of a poor peasant in Bolivia who's made unhappy or not by inequality. We have no way of knowing because he or she has no way to reveal a preference. That's an institutional arrangement that an individual can't change. Or think about decisions that are not the result of optimal rational choices, but say impose norms or addiction or self-control problems. So think about somebody in the lower caste in India who doesn't send his or her child to school. Is that really an optimal choice, or is that just a behavior that's a result of a strongly imposed norm? And so with these metrics, we can answer questions as diverse as the effects of commuting time on well-being. It turns out commuting time is one of the most miserable times of the day for most people, but then why do they buy houses far away from wherever they work? Why cigarette taxes make smokers happier. There's a study in Canada that shows indeed they do. Again, if you think of this as a revealed preference, it doesn't make any sense, but if you think of it as an addiction or self-control problem, you have a different understanding of it. Why the unemployed are less unhappy with higher local unemployment rates, and why people adapt to things like crime and corruption. So with these metrics, we're understanding human behavior in a way that complements traditional economic approaches. And then the last thing, initially there was a lot of skepticism about using survey data in economics. The idea was that, you can't believe what people say, there's no consequence to what people say, they can say anything as they answer a survey. Well, it turns out that if you think about most data, or income data for developing economies, it's based on household expenditure surveys. And I would argue there's a lot less incentive to be dishonest in the answer to a happiness or a well-being survey than to a long survey about how much income you have, right? So more and more we're finding that these surveys are pretty robust, that we can control for error the same way we control for error in income-based data. And it's just increasingly common in economics to use survey data and surveys of reported well-being. Very important is to understand the terminology, because initially we were just using whatever questions we had in the surveys, and they were usually open-ended questions, generally speaking, how happy are you with your life, or generally speaking, how satisfied are you with your life. But over time we found that there are differences across these questions. So happiness is the most open-ended of the terms, and it attracts the most public attention, and I confess it's in the title of all my books because it sells books. But it's really not a very well-defined term, because it could be how happy are you with your life in general, or it could be how happy are you today, and those are very different things. Life satisfaction, how satisfied are you with your life in general, is close to how happy are you with your life in general, but it's a little more framed. If you're asked how happy are you with your life in general, you think about your life course. Could be the past, it could be the future. And so people will evaluate their life circumstances as a whole. There are other questions like the ladder of life question that are very similar to life satisfaction. All of these are capturing what we call evaluative well-being, how you think of your life as a whole, your situation as a whole. But there's a whole other dimension of well-being that we measure called hedonic or experience well-being, and that measures how people experience their daily lives. What is their mood or their temperament as they go through their daily activities? Are they worried? Are they stressed? Are they angry? Are they smiling? Are they happy? And then we can see how different experiences correlate with people's moods and affect. So just quickly, I want to show you a couple of consistencies that we find across the world, so that then it's important that you understand how we measure this stuff, what's consistent, so when then we can look at things that vary. So this is something that got attention or got economists interested in the whole topic of happiness or well-being, and it's something we call the Easterlin paradox. So this is GDP per capita adjusted on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is percent above neutral in a country on life satisfaction. And so the Easterlin paradox went two ways. It was both an over-time paradox and a cross-country paradox. So over time, Easterlin found that as countries grew, he was writing only about the wealthy countries, but as countries grew wealthier over time, average levels of happiness didn't increase, which ran counter to economic theory. Japan quintupled its income in 3 decades, and average happiness levels fell. The US had the fastest growth of any OECD country until about 2001, and average happiness levels were flat over those 3 decades. And then there's a cross-country paradox, which is that he finds no linear relationship between average levels of per capita GDP and average levels of happiness. So if you look at this chart, we could argue all day, and I could spend the entire rest of my time on this, but I won't, about whether there is or isn't an Easterland paradox. Because surely the wealthier countries are, on average, happier than the poorer countries. But there's no clear pattern among the wealthy countries. They're sort of scattered. And there's even less of a pattern across the poor countries. So why is this? Well, anybody who's thought about sustainable development knows that there are countries like Costa Rica that use their resources and put them into public education, environment, and other things, and have higher levels of development than their income levels would predict. It turns out they also have higher levels of happiness. So if you look at this, a lot of the Latin American countries are above the line and happier than their incomes would predict. I'm from Peru, so this makes me happy. I also know Latin America has good quality of life in general. Democracy for the most part, decent, maybe not great, but decent public services, available health care, available education, compared to some of the countries down here. And then if you look at the least happy countries, Pakistan, Tanzania, Belarus, they're violent, they're poor, they're not democratic. So a lot of the things that matter to well-being, like freedom, good health, good environment, are now attainable for countries at lower levels of per capita income than they might have been otherwise. So I was taken with Bill's slide where he showed the US in 1850 and where it is now. But because of technology, because of public health, because of, I think, the diffusion of democracy around the world, countries are able to, if they can achieve it, have better quality of life at lower levels of income than I think was previously the case. Now, just a quick last thing on this slide. The problem with these cross-country comparisons, they get a lot of attention in the press, and everybody likes to know where their country is and how they scored compared to somebody else's country. But you're also, in these average country responses, you are not controlling for cultural differences in the way people answer surveys. So if you look here, France scores well below where its income would predict. My grandmother was from Paris, and she was very dour. And I learned very quickly as a cheerful Peruvian little girl that you didn't bounce into Parisian coffee shops and sort of, smile, and, you had to be very, kind of understated. It's the French thing. Meanwhile, I had a British friend who got so tired of being told to have a nice day when she traveled around the US that she started saying, "Thank you, I have other plans." So there are just cultural differences in the way people answer surveys that when we do these country comparisons, we're not controlling for. And we're much more robust when we measure well-being at the individual level. So this slide will make you happy or unhappy depending on where you are. This is one of the real consistencies across people all over the world. I found this everywhere, literally every country in the world, with the exception of like 5 out of over 160 countries, displays this U-curve between happiness and age. So what do we get? We get a midlife dip, which is somewhere between 44 for the US and Europe and about 47 for Latin America. And then the tragedy is that unhappier countries, say for example Russia, turn later. The Russians turn at about 52, which is about life expectancy for males. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what's going on. But what else drives this? Some of it is psychological. Young people have more emotional swings than old people. Old people achieve more emotional stability. As they age, there's a kind of aspirations aligning with reality effect. And then there's also selection bias because happier people live longer, right? Again, I could go on about this, but I won't. But we have studied.
Leave the house. That's what's happening.
Yeah, there's that. Oh, there's also, this is aspirations aligning with reality effect. By the time you're 44 and you don't play guitar and you don't sing, you should probably give up on being a rock star. Rock star. But in any event, all these things seem to be the point of this is that these things are consistent across people everywhere, from Mongolia to China to the US to Chile. What else do we know very quickly? To happiness and age. What income does matter to happiness and well-being. Everywhere we've studied it, within countries, people who are destitute are significantly less happy than people that have means. So how much income you need is a different story and the topic for a whole other lecture, but income matters. Health matters Health matters even more than income if you are to attach relative weights to these things. Employment, very important. Everywhere we study this, people who are unemployed but wish to be in the labor market are significantly less happy than others. Marriage. There's a lot of attention is given to the fact that married people are happier than unmarried people in these surveys. I hate to break it to you, it's a complete artifact of construction. So if you're looking in a cross-section survey, you're comparing two people who married each other to people who didn't marry, and it turns out happier people marry each other. The overtime effect of marriage seems to be about 18 months, and then people return to their natural lives of happiness. Again, sorry to burst, I hate to burst bubbles here. There's a great paper by my colleague Claudia Senek in Paris called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife," and it turns out the probability of divorce is highest when you have asymmetries in happiness levels. So it's better to have two happy people married to each other or two unhappy people married to each other, but you don't want a happy and an unhappy person married to each other because they drive each other nuts. Okay, I could go, again, I can't go on too more. I wanted one last slide on how we do this without walking you through an econometric equation, but it's important that you know we are not running around asking people, does marriage make you happy, does corruption make you unhappy? What we do is we take on the left-hand side of these equations, we have whatever well-being metric we may be measuring. It could be life satisfaction, it could be smiling yesterday, it could be angry yesterday. And then we control for people's age, income, gender, employment status, rural, urban, country where they live in, year that we did the survey, anything we possibly can do. The things we know are consistent, and then we can look at the effects of things that vary. So once we control for all these things, we can look at things that change, like whether people live with more or less inflation, more or less unemployment rates, the quality of the environment, and personal behaviors, whether they smoke or exercise or whatever they might do. And then we can see if people, holding all else equal, who smoke are less happy than people who don't smoke, or that sort of thing. Turns out, yes, smokers are less happy than non-smokers. Okay, so quickly, there's a chapter in my last book called Bentham or Aristotle in the Statistics Office, and the idea is that there's broad agreement now among scholars who measure this, that they're two related but distinct dimensions of well-being. And I mentioned this. There's the Benthamite kind of well-being, which is the hedonic or experience well-being that I talked about. People maximizing contentment and pleasure, or maximizing the contentment and pleasure of the greatest number of individuals as they experience their lives on a day-to-day basis, right? And then there's the Aristotelian concept of well-being, which is much more like evaluative well-being. It comes from the Greek word eudaimonia, which combines two concepts, eu meaning well-being or abundance, so having sufficient means, and then daemon meaning the control over an individual's destiny. So this implicitly includes people's capacity to lead a purposeful or meaningful life. So it's a more complicated concept. It's what evaluative well-being at least implicitly captures. So here's to the point of poverty. One of the things that we find is lacking capacity. Individuals have, I'm known in the literature for something called the happy peasant and frustrated achiever problem. So lacking capacity due to poverty or in strongly imposed norms, people may place more value on day-to-day experiences such as friendship, religion, daily living. If you're just struggling to get through every day and you're asked, how happy are you? You're going to say, well, I'm okay today. I have my friends, I have my family. I made it through today. I'm happy. And that's what we find. We find remarkably high levels of happiness when it's not well defined among poor people, precisely because they're thinking in the daily dimension. When we ask more explicitly about their capacity to lead fulfilling lives, when we just ask a more framed life satisfaction question, they then score lower. Meanwhile, people with more capacity may have less time and interest in day-to-day experiences, particularly if they're very focused on some overarching objective or achievement. Anybody who's been through grad school knows that you may give up a lot for some longer-term perspective that's going to make your life better over the long run. Okay, so one of the things that we find is that income matters more to evaluative well-being than to the daily experience well-being. So if you're starving, it's bad for all dimensions of well-being. But after a certain amount of money, just having enough, more income won't make your mood better, it won't make your natural affect higher. It won't make, being with your friends better or worse. Versus more income correlates much more closely with evaluative well-being all the way up the income chain. And I don't think it is that money makes people happier. It's that having means gives people the opportunity. They have opportunities and choices, and they can lead the kinds of lives they want to lead. So when you ask people how satisfied are you with your life in general, it's not a surprise that people with more means are more satisfied because they have more control over their lives. One of the things we find with very poor people is that they live with a lot of daily stress, and it's stress that's associated with circumstances beyond their control. It's very different from stress that's associated with goal achievement, right? You can't control it. It's a constant negative shock. And there's a wonderful, if rather sad book by Sendhil Nathan and Eldar Shafir called Scarcity. And they show that when poor people live with this kind of stress for a long enough period of time, it starts to have cognitive effects, right? You can't plan ahead. If you can never plan ahead, then you can't plan ahead, right? And so it becomes a self-fulfilling vicious cycle. So this slide may surprise you, but it's from the US, which is looking pretty bad right now in terms of divisions between rich and poor. So this is a question, did you experience stress yesterday? This is Latin America. This is the US. So Latin Americans experience significantly less stress on a daily basis than Americans. Again, as I said, Latin America is a great place to live. But the more important thing is that this is the difference between rich and poor, right? So the difference between experiencing stress across, these are the rich and these are the poor, right? Between rich and poor in the US is almost twice that in Latin America. So our gaps, the lives, the differences between the lives of the rich and poor, at least as measured by stress, are much greater in the US than they are in Latin America. And this is the one that really struck me when I found this. This is a question about believing that hard work can get you ahead. The American dream question, right? It captures the American dream. Everybody who works hard can get ahead. Well, if you look at this, the poor in the US are significantly less likely to say that hard work can get them ahead than the poor in Latin America. And the gap between the poor and the rich in the US is enormous. So the rich in the US are much more likely to say that hard work can get them ahead. No doubt it does and did in most cases, but there's also something called learners' beliefs in a just world. So you want to believe that hard work, if you're ahead in the system, you certainly want to believe that hard work got you there. So the US now has divisions across the rich and poor that are worse than some developing regions. And it's something I've been thinking and writing about a lot. But it's also telling you things about the nature of poverty. I'm going to skip this. That's just showing that good stress, that stress associated, if you have stress but you have income and education, it's much less bad for your well-being. This is just showing that inequality in the US, this is MSA, metropolitan statistical areas in the United States, bigger than zip codes, smaller than states, that the higher levels of inequality, the more stress experienced by the poor. And this is social support among the poor. The more inequality, the less social support among the poor. Also less social support among the rich. So it's inequality is part of our story. It's also part of the story in many poor countries. If the gaps between the rich and poor are great enough, the poor often give up. Success is unachievable because it's so far away. Now, very quickly, adaptation. One of the things we find is that because there's a remarkable capacity for humans to adapt to adversity, right? And say they're okay. And that's a great thing from an individual perspective. But what you have is when a lot of people collectively adapt to adversity, right, they get used to norms of poor governance, norms of poor health, and simply adapt to them and don't push for change. It's telling that we find that people in Kenya are as satisfied with their health as people in the US. People in Guatemala are more satisfied with their health than people in Chile. Their health is significantly worse. It's just that they've adapted to poor norms of health. So adaptation is a trick in all this because it's kind of, on the one hand, it preserves individual well-being, and on the other hand, it results in collective bad outcomes. And let me buzz along here. The other thing that we find a lot are progress paradoxes. So I mentioned the happy peasants. Well, what about the frustrated achievers? we find that often people with high levels of upward mobility, or migrants who go from rural to urban areas and quintuple their income, say, are significantly less happy than non-migrants. Or the people with upward mobility seem more frustrated and less happy than people with no mobility. Again, here you have a story of progress paradoxes where change is difficult, and also often accompanying change are rising aspirations, right? Your norms of what's a good life change, what you need to have a good life change. You get more understanding of people around you, how much better they live than you do. So, and this plays out at the country level. We find something called the paradox of unhappy growth across countries, where controlling for everything else, countries with higher rates of growth, these are very high rates of growth in middle-income developing countries, the Koreas, Brazils, and Chinas, people are actually less satisfied with their life than those in lower countries with lower rates of growth. In China, in the 1980s, the growth boom, when growth was going like this, life satisfaction was going like that, and suicide rates skyrocketed, as did mental health reports. So, again, a progress paradox. Over time, you obviously need growth to make progress, but it tells you that the nature and pattern of growth matters. It also tells you that I think it's a warning that some kinds of growth are not sustainable. When we're thinking about sustainable development, growth that causes huge increases or decreases in life satisfaction, as in the case of China, had some really downsides in terms of China's development path. It also, I think, helps us understand why there isn't social unrest in countries that just have persistent poverty traps, and then things start to change for the better and everything explodes. The last thing, and this is that one of the things that we also are finding and intersecting with all this is that there's a bell curve in the distribution of well-being across people, and most people are in the average, in the fat part of the bell. But they're outliers, the least happy and the most happy, and they actually behave a little bit differently. So the happiest people value money the least. They value learning and creativity a lot. The least happy people value money the most, and they're also the least resilient in terms of things like unemployment shocks. So one of the tricks with all of this is disentangling what's inherent to people's character traits as we look at and try and analyze trends in well-being, and what is caused by the environment, and what is obviously much more relevant to policy. The last thing, we've been using these metrics. There are a lot of people that want to replace GDP per capita with happiness or gross national happiness. In fact, Jeff, who you just heard this morning, has been known to say that kind of thing. He has, I have to say, I'm pleased that he's so interested in this stuff, but he's really a proponent of using happiness as an object or a measure of progress, and an objective of policy. I personally think these metrics are much better as complements to what's in well-being, to complement statistics, and when you find differences in what the income metrics tell you and well-being metrics tell you, there's a lot to learn there. And they're going into official statistics. The British have life satisfaction, experience well-being, a positive question, happy yesterday, a negative question, stress yesterday, and they have an actual life purpose or meaning in life question. They have an Aristotelian question in their statistics, and they're using those pretty much every day. Every year they come out. So, and then just the two last points very quickly. One is, this sounds very nerdy, but cardinality versus ordinality. So when we ask these questions, we're asked, the answers are on a scale that go from 0 to 10, right? How satisfied are you with your life? But they're ordinal. The scale is ordinal, so we don't know. People place themselves in these categories. We can't say that an 8 is twice 4 in life satisfaction terms. But I think we can and have to get better at saying, do we worry more about reducing misery or increasing the happiness of the already happy? And that's a question that dovetails with how prioritizing poverty versus how much you need. You need aggregate levels of growth to go up to reduce poverty, but how much you prioritize poverty reduction in your strategy. And then the last thing is what's a meaningful change in well-being. So all of you know that a 1% increase in the unemployment rate is a bad thing. You probably also know that a 0.1% increase in the unemployment rate is not really worthy of note. You probably don't know how many unemployed people move in each case. It's not that many. It's, 1% or 0.1% of the unemployed pool. But you're used to hearing that statistics in the news, on TV, in the papers. So the statistic is meaningful because you're used to it, because you've become accustomed to it. But if I told you that average national happiness in the U.S. increased from 6.2 to 7 last year on a 10-point scale, you wouldn't know if that was good, bad, or indifferent. It turns out that's a huge movement, a lot of people moving up the life satisfaction scale. But we need to, that's one thing that's still missing, is how do you explain these metrics to the public, right? And when the Brits first started using them, the public was all over the map, and now they're used to hearing about them, each year and comparing their districts or comparing whatever it might be, or looking at the effects of commuting time on well-being as part of just national statistics. So we have somewhere to go there. But anyway, back to the basic point, I think one of these the most important thing these metrics do when we think about poverty reduction is they can give us a gauge of people's capacity to lead meaningful or purposeful lives, or the kinds of lives they want to lead. And when I think about poverty reduction, there's certainly income thresholds and health indicators and everything else that tell us a lot about what's going on with poverty. But I think that the kind of deeper objective of sustainable development is to give people the chance to have some sort of control over their lives and to lead the kinds of lives they want to lead. And I think these metrics are useful in at least helping us understand that. So thank you.
Go ahead, Dan. So, very well.
Oh, thank you. I should probably just get rid of this. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My experienced well-being level is very high at this moment because I was sitting in the overflow room and listening to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and I was wondering whether I'll be able to get into this room and find a place. And I'm so happy there is a lot of space now here. I'm quite relieved. The chair, Professor Evans, has given us a very good overview in terms of framing the issues, and now we have got a very interesting analytical and conceptual presentation. And I was wondering whether my intervention now will sound more hedonic well-being improvement or not. But let me try. The theme of the conference had been, you have seen the two P's over there, planet and poor. And the discussion which I'm going to have will include three more P's. One is prosperity, another is peace, and the third one is partnership. There are three other P's, and all these P's have been mentioned in the SDGs, as you may know. Now, Professor Evans has given us a very good overview about the achievements which human being has been scoring during the last decade or so, if not through centuries, and the improvement which has taken place. Even if you take just the last decade, the decade and a half, 2000 onward, the average GDP, global GDP, has doubled, more than from 5,000 and a half USD to 10,000 plus USD. So there had been a great leap forward, and with mortality rate, maternal mortality, infant mortality, and many other issues together, you will see that achievements had been across the board through many indicators. But as the SDGs will tell us, that the success will be defined by the most, I think, powerful statement which has been made in the recent past, is not to leave anyone behind. So the success will be defined by the last or the lowest common denominator in terms of achievement. So In fact, it's a great achievement that have moved away from these aggregates and averages, and we have come to the disaggregate and looking at the invisible, making the invisible visible in the SDG process. I think that analytical change, or the perceptual change, needs to be captured as we move with SDGs. I think Professor Sachs yesterday and Sarah told us that it is a magical moment. Well, we have all debated whether the Millennium Moment has been recreated or not in 2015. But the question is whether it is magic or an illusion. And if it is a magic, then it means that there is a supernatural force which is bringing about changes which we would like to see. Whereas illusion is something which we are made to see and interpreted by our senses, but which do not really exist. So the moment which we see the convergence which we are talking about, whether it's a moment of magic or a moment of illusion. So what I will try to do is to go through a bit of a reality check in this case. Because, say, for example, yesterday we remembered the three great convergence, SDG adaptation, adoption, the COP21 resolution, and Pope Francis coming into the fray. But we, at the same time, conveniently forgot that the Addis meeting on financing for development did not really generate the necessary resources which are very important for implementation of the SDGs. We couldn't really forget that the Nairobi meeting of the WTO did not come out with not only anything substantive, resultative, but in fact questions the multilateral trading regime and the Doha development round. So what I'm trying to say is that whilst if you follow Professor Sachs' yesterday's speech and today's speech, how he was moving from a very inspiring, upbeat, speech to more a realistic, challenging speech where the tensions are being said. So let me take that particular line a bit more forward and put in a bit more tension in this process. If you look at the share of the global poor, since it is about global poverty and global poor, so we have reduced from more than 500 million poor people in 2000 onward and to less than 1 billion poor people now in the world. It's true, it's a great achievement. Even if we take away India and China from the equation, it is still a great achievement to have those 600 million people over there. But the least developed countries, those who are not only handicapped by income, but also human assets and also by other economic vulnerability indices. This is the UN categories. There are 48 countries in the world. The only one around US is Haiti. The rest, majority of them are in Africa, some of them in Asia, Bangladesh included. And there is the Pacific island countries, the small and island development states. So if you look at that, so during this period, the share of the LDCs, and the LDCs are poor, as I said, in multiple accounts, and they account for more than 13% of the global population, less than 2% of the global GDP, less than 1% of FDI, less than 1% of global trade, less than 0.5% of global services export. So these are a really structurally handicapped, historically punished, geographically disadvantaged set of countries over here. So the share of poor in this global poor of the LDCs, in fact, did not go down. In fact, it has increased from, say, for example, 35, 40% to more than 50% now. So the poorer may not be following Professor Evans' definition and others, is that it may not become poorer, but definitely, relatively, remains poorer and more concentrated over there. If you look also at not only the income, but also the wealth part. So the concentration of the wealth in the world definitely has increased during the period when we were making all those big achievements. So I think from 2000 onward, the share of global wealth to the richest 1% has gone up from 44% and crossing the most critical number, more than 50% in 2014. So 1% of the world richest people now controls more than 50% of the global wealth. So both in terms of flow and in terms of stock, the world has definitely become more skewed in terms of access to wealth and income. I don't know about happiness. So, but definitely the life satisfaction has really been reduced in terms of relative opportunity. And as an economist, as you know, I only understand relative prices, not absolute prices. So, and if you look at them during this period, I'm just giving you episodic indicators of how life has changed and did not change, if not have become worse. So there are a number of countries now considered to be fragile states during this very period has increased from number 33 to 37. So numbers of countries, and if you add to them specifically the conflict countries, the numbers, and post-conflict countries, the number will go even higher. But more importantly, within these 33 increased to 37 fragile countries, 28 of them are least developed countries. So there is an overlap of this economic marginalization as well as the possibility or tendency to be conflict prone, much more higher and going hand in hand as we see globally. So I may go on these issues more and tell you that on the one hand, the aggregate achievements are tremendous, but on the other hand, there are significant pockets of much more deepened crisis, both in terms of economic achievements, social deprivation, access, freedom of various sorts in that way, and of course, also to access to environmental goods. So that is one particular area we should not forget. So I think the SDGs have given us a very good perspective that how to disaggregate all these things, look at people who are left behind, and define our global success through that particular prism as we move. Now, there seems to be yesterday, and it was mentioned today also, that we have all the solutions. It is only what we need to do is to implement them under the right leadership. I think that is very, very inspiring statement. And I would really want to do a bit of a reality check on those two. Well, I take on what has been mentioned by Professor Graham sometimes back. This is about, I don't know whether I'm looking at it right, that is this ordinal versus cardinal comparison. So take, for example, goal number 1 and apply that particular approach into goal number 1, eradication of poverty. We are economists and we have these tools, what we call beyond synergy. There are trade-offs. Relative prices and trade-offs are some of the things we do, or reality checks while policy choices are made. Now, the hardcore poor, the residual 1% or 2%, the amount of resources which are necessary for doing away that 1% of hardcore poverty versus better quality educations for the overwhelming youthful labor force in a country. Where would be a better investment in terms of this 1%, which may be a moral issue, definitely, apart from economic issue, versus the investment opportunities of improving quality of education for the next generation and how to do a sustainable growth. I don't know what is the technical solution to that, because whether we can really apply techniques over there or we make a moral judgment over there, and how do you really solve that particular issue over there? So I still find there are choices to be made, and we are not quite sure what are the basis of those choices and whether economics can fully answer that particular choice as we move forward, because there are a lot of being on contextual. Now, taking on the more bigger challenges or the other pitfalls which we have as we move forward in the next 10, 15 years. The first one, I think, which we should not underestimate in many ways, is the demographic challenge. The youth bulge is very much there, and with zero employment growth, with the jobless growth in many countries, this has become a major issue. There is hardly 1/4 of the new entrant into the into the labor market in the developing countries. They hardly get a formal sector job. Most of them are indecent job in the informal sector, based on self-exploitation in many ways. So I think the demographic bulge or the demographic dividend, which will be reaped by certain countries, and how it will move forward, and how it will really reshape the labor market, and whether we have a global framework to handle that particular thing, that will be a real issue. I'm not talking about what's happening into Europe at this very moment from the migrant influx and others. I'm talking about a predictable labor force management strategy in a global frame as we move. So that is one particular area which will follow from the SDG implementation in the coming days. The new pandemics, this is another new threat as we go. Every other quarter, a new type of virus is showing up. It is either Ebola, whether it is Zika or SARS in Southeast Asia. So the new global health challenges, and these are all very much looking at our face. The technology debate is coming back into fray once again. The technology, the automation and others is really coming in with the new threat of making people jobless or not being able to join in because of the skills deficit, quality of education deficit, and etc., and relative returns becoming higher to educated people and others. So the technological part, technology implication, is revisiting us, coming through a full cycle as it seems to be, which is not quite often. Those who are technology enthusiasts really don't look at the other policy challenges which are involved in this particular area. Environment has been talked about. I am not an expert. I am at the receiving end. I can only pollute the environment as I'm doing it with the noise at this moment. But the rest is, as you know, I will not talk about. The governance issue is definitely a new thing. We are observing many countries in the world now. Earlier, well, let me put it in this way. Earlier, the issue was very simple, black and white, that you have non-democratic countries and you have democratic countries, market economies in one place, the other is not there, free media here and free media not there. Now we have a lot of countries who have elected government but behave as quasi-fascist ways. Suppressing media, I don't want to name names, and I want to travel a bit more in the world. And they're suppressing media, suppressing civil society, suppressing all types of dissents, but they're elected countries of the modern world. So this type of dichotomy was not there, or this type of countries were not there before, and most of them, many of them, are star performers in development in Asia and Africa too. And I'm talking both the Central Europe, I'm talking about Asia, I'm talking about Africa, and definitely Latin America. The other challenge we see is, of course, the economic area. I've just mentioned part of it, the deprivation and the marginalization as it continues with the growth of prosperity and others. And the last but not the least, the security challenge. Security challenge has become not only about human existence issue, but it is also affecting the economic transaction cost now in many ways. Starting from the increase in the insurance cost to many other parts of movement of goods and services have become a bit more difficult now, and we are not quite sure. And I'm not talking about Somali pirates here. And so it is really another new area which is there. So I'm just listing to you that if you have solution to all these problems, oh my God, save yourselves, and you can do it in any ways. And what I'm trying to tell is that there are new challenges which are on our way, and we quite often do not fully recognize that. Let me put them into one framework and then close. My grandmother told me never give more than 3 ideas. The 4th one will never be remembered anyway. But since then I have met with smart people like you, and I know how to put 3 more under each of the 3. So I'm coming to my last point over here. So what needs to be done? And there. You see, all these 4 or 5, 6 challenges which I have mentioned, starting from demography and listing up to security, there's one common thread which has to be followed. It is that it cannot happen, all these things cannot be mitigated without global partnership. Global partnership is very, very essential in this case. And that global partnership has to be a shared multilateralism. Some people call it new multilateralism. Why? And if you look at the way the world is now moving, that it is moving precisely away from that. And let me take an area which I understand a bit more than other areas, the trade negotiations. So in Nairobi, it became very clear, United States is no more interested in WTO, and particularly with the TTIP and TPP out there. So we are seeing the mega regionals, the mega trading blocs coming up, and the multilateralism is no more very much in vogue. Similarly, if you look at the resource flows and others, the earlier consensus on the 0.7% of the GNI to be given to the developing countries, and in particular 0.2% of the GNI, 50% of it, if not, to the LDCs, is no more there. So the flow of ODA is already reducing to from 2013 onward. And this year, it is going to reduce further because, you know, by definition, the first year's in-country cost of migrants which are there can be considered as ODA given to that particular country over there. So the ODA, which will be now, you will see the picture, the numbers, are not necessarily the amount which has been transferred to that country, but it will be then which has been used in the in-country to deal with particular the issues over there. Similarly, if you look at the other FDI flow and et cetera, the volatility and et cetera is all very there. So multilateralism, how it will really match the new agenda of SDGs remains one critical challenge. Two other points, and this is the other two under the third point, is the coherence issue. You know, along with multilateralism, the area which is not really looked into is that, but SDGs calls for that. SDG is an integrated one. It doesn't talk about a silo. It wants to break down the silo approach. So how do you really see that all our policies are coherent and they're really servicing one particular objective? Now, if you see the goal number 17.13, 17.14, 17.15, where there is talk about the ownership of the results to be owned through development cooperation, the policy space to be given, and the coherence to be attained by the financial and macroeconomic stability, there are indicators. So does anybody apply them in their own country, doing real policy making, and particularly in the future? And the third fault line, multilateralism, coherence, and the third fault line is accountability. If you look at the SDG, and you have all followed it from close quarter, the agenda is tremendous. It's very ambitious. The means of implementation, mediocre. And the review and accountability framework, monitoring, very shabby. You know very well the politics of it. It was called monitoring and accountability, that section. It has to be moderated, and now it is called review and follow-up. So the word accountability has vanished. The mutual accountability word has vanished. This is the politics of consensus building, the so-called convergence. It is the price you pay when you want to converge. That is what is being there. So the whole point is that whether we are ready to apply these things in our everyday policy making, the accountability within country, between countries, in front of the global community, to have a coherent approach, whether one hand giveth and the other hand taketh will not happen. And we'll deal with also the issue of multilateral and structural issues over there. I think the best economist now around, at least the analyst, I don't know economist, is Prof. Francis. He says, repression, assassination, or other violation of human rights are very important. I'm not really quoting him correctly. But the structural inequality, the structural problems, constraint which produces inequalities are no less important than violates the human right, no less than the repression and assassination and other. So whether we will address that structural issues or not in the coming days, or hide behind the averages, that will be something we will look forward to. Do I go out from this podium more happier now that I have sublimated my anxiety with all of you and have shared the very unwell being with all of you now. And I say yes, because I remain still very, very aspirationally optimist, because leadership is important. That was the closing words of Jeffrey Sachs. And this year, two most important leadership changes coming up. One is in the biggest economy in the world. The leadership is going to change, hopefully with continuity. And the leadership is going to change. It will be in the largest organization in the world, the United Nations. So we're going to have a new president in the US and a new Secretary General in the United Nations. And we already have the Pope, new one. So I think that is the new convergence I'm looking forward to. So don't hold my words against me. I am an optimist, but a cautious one. Thank you very much for the attention.
We have about 7 minutes for questions. In order to ask a question, you have to have a microphone, so it can be on the videotape. So if anyone, just raise your hand and we'll bring the mics over. While that's happening, I'll ask Carol a question to get it started. So there's a lot of research on the policy side that takes a look at what are the economic consequences of things like the earned income tax credit hikes or welfare reform or Medicaid expansions. Are people starting to use happiness as an outcome for policy evaluation in those situations as well?
Yes, actually. We did one paper looking at the well-being effects of being a transfer recipient, and found that controlling for everything else, income and everything else, being a recipient made people less happy because of the stigma attached to it. And that wasn't just the government transfers, private transfers. Mm-hmm. It's sort of, I think, the extent to which needing help in the U.S. has become so stigmatized. But it's also been used, for example, one of the early evaluations of the Moving to Opportunity program. The early stage evaluation found no effect on the kids, but found an increase in life satisfaction on the mothers. And then the later evaluations found good effects for the kids. So it actually was a leading indicator in some ways, something that changed more quickly than children's outcomes, which change a lot of different ways. So there are lots of ways you can again, I see it as an additional input into a metric that you're using. I don't see it as the only indicator. Another example is that it's now being used, well-being as part of cost-benefit analysis. So in the British case, there was a proposal to close all the rural post offices in Britain. Because if you think about it, they're expensive to maintain, they don't deliver much mail, you've got to keep these post offices open. But the well-being metrics showed that the visit to the rural post office was the most important part of most rural respondents' day, particularly elderly respondents who are quite isolated. So I don't know what they did in the end, but it certainly was a heads up that if you close these things, there are going to be some negative externalities you might not have thought about.
Okay, great. There was Scott?
Bishop Marcello and I both have questions, different questions. For the sake of time, maybe we'll ask them together and then the panelists can respond. My question is this. Professor Evans, I think very helpfully, opened with I think the one point in the panel that may be a point of some disputation or even disagreement, perhaps not, and this was his critique of Laudato Si on the question of markets. And Bill mentioned that there are market mechanisms that really could be employed to address some of the things the Pope is hoping for in the reduction of poverty and of inequality. I'd like I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'd like a little discussion of that. Maybe briefly from Bill, a little bit more about what those market mechanisms might be, and whether other people think that would be an effective way, and that critique itself is something you would agree with. So that's my question. Bishop Marcello has a different one.
I want to remark that in the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, that is happiness, is a little different. Because he put the question, we can be happy if we are able to develop our capabilities, and not we have right to this or right to the other. Yeah, we have right to develop our capabilities. And in this sense, I think the approach of Matthiasen when he say it's more important to put the rights in relation of the capabilities that to have an concept abstract of rights. I think in this sense, we can have some analogy between the concept of happiness of Aristotle, that is the concept of the virtue, that is the realization of the capabilities, that the other concept of the, because really the question is, what is the contents of the happiness? And this is the question. The happiness, the contents of the happiness is not to have money. We need money, but it's not this that gives the happiness. And this is the discussion that I think that we need to put in focus. Thank you.
Well, let me just talk a little bit more about, very quickly, about the market mechanisms and draw an analogy. Back in 1965, smoking rates among adults were 45% in this country. How do we try to deal with that problem? We try to educate people and tell people smoking's bad and do all kinds of things. And most of that was an abject failure. Economists for years were saying, look, demand curve sloped down. Why don't you just raise the price of cigarettes? And people said, nah, that's not going to work. It's an addictive product. So, generating some evidence, what do we find? Well, smokers respond to raising taxes. Now, states are addicted to raising taxes, and smoking rates are about 19% among adults. Why is that? Because it costs $8 a pack to buy a pack of cigarettes. Most of that is due to taxes. Taxes are a very effective way of trying to signal what the market price is, and what's the problem? We're using too much carbon. So if we want to change behavior, well, we can tax the carbon unit that's actually being produced. Why aren't we investing in a lot of other alternative technologies? Because the price of fossil fuels is way too low. And until that price goes up, then we're not going to have all that much investment. So how can we raise the price? Well, one alternative is to actually tax the carbon. So I think that there are market mechanisms out there that can encourage the investment into alternative energy strategies, but that's not going to occur. Well, I mean, we can let government agencies decide who the winners and losers are and dump money on Solyndra and stuff like that. But until we have people who actually are going to put their money where their mouth is, we're not going to get any new innovation. And the way that we're going to encourage that is to change the relative prices out there. Yeah.
I'm very happy, Reverend Father, that you have mentioned amortization, and I would have also fallen back on the entitlement theory and how it relates to ensuring one's better opportunities in life. But market mechanism is important, no doubt about that, and we have tried to use those in various cases, from environment to control to all other bad habits, and also to encourage good ones. So, but there is experience that as long as the society has structural problems, structural inequalities, which comes along with it. And there are people who are outside the market also, who do not operate in the market, either in the labor market or in the property market or in the asset market or in the commodity markets. So how do you really help them? Let me give you a concrete example, since Scott was and others were encouraging concrete examples since yesterday. You know the BRAC, the largest NGO in the world. I sit in the board. So now, when we saw the poverty alleviation is getting really difficult, we cannot get to the poorest of the poor. They are the relatively poor who are getting out of it. It is the relatively less poor who are also migrating for migration for income abroad. So what do you deal with them? So that is when we conceived of the transfer program, where you hand over money just like that, transfer to the poorest of the poor household, so they can access all the education opportunities, they can access reading livestock and others, and they can also do some of the health issues and etc. So transfer program, those who are really not in the market in certain ways, is also very, very important. That's a non-market intervention. So the issue is how intelligently we can combine these two, and one does not really eat away the other in certain ways. So I would take a much more nuanced view on that market issue when it comes to dealing with poverty, at least.
Well, just one thing on markets and then to Aristotle. I think, there are nuances. Without markets, we can't get anywhere. We've seen very large failed experiments with major countries trying to plan everything centrally, and terrible health and democracy and other kinds of indicators. So you certainly need markets. I agree on the transfers and the need to, so there are people that are sort of left out. And I think there's an additional issue that I'm not sure we really know the solution to, which is just that structural changes in economies, in the world economy, that are rewarding high skills and that are displacing low-skilled labor, due to technology. It's not a nefarious thing. It's just what's happening in terms of innovation and productivity. I think make us or are going to force us to rethink how labor markets work, because what we do have, some of the increases in inequality that we see, certainly in the U.S., but also I think more generally internationally, are just changes in rewards to different skill sets. And maybe the solution is making it so that every human being can get high-skilled university education. I don't think that's going to happen. But we do have to think more creatively about addressing the trends towards structural inequality, and taxation may be part of that process. For example, in the U.S., where inequality has increased at unprecedented rates in the past couple decades, tax policy has been regressive. On Aristotle, which I probably know more about than taxation, I completely agree with you that it's not about the right to happiness. It's about the capability to lead a fulfilling life, and how one defines fulfilling may vary, and some may be more purposeful than others, but it is about people's ability to seek some sort of life fulfillment and happiness. Even Jefferson was very much influenced by Aristotle, and in the Declaration of Independence, it's not the right to happiness, it's the right to the pursuit of happiness. And I think that very much speaks to this capabilities argument. And then just to highlight the whole issue of kind of fulfillment and creativity, it's interesting to me that the happiest part of the distribution of people in the world are least interested in money and most interested in learning and creativity. So then again, that to me rings true with a lot of what you were saying.
All right, I think we're at 10:30 and you guys need a break, or 11:30 and you guys need a break. So we have an announcement real quick.
There's coffee in the lobby. We'll reconvene at 11:45.
So,
Do you
all
have
right.
a question like that?